This week marks the anniversary of landmark legislation for women. 93 years ago, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women were granted the right to vote. Although we've celebrated this anniversary every year since it was designated Women's Equality Day in 1971, this year it's more important than ever to remember that the struggle for women's equality continues as states across the country and members of Congress try to strip away at a woman's right to choose. The past 3 years, state legislatures have seen a record number of restrictions on abortion. And according to analysis by the Huffington Post, over the same time period, at least 54 abortion providers across 27 states have been forced to shut down or to end their abortion services. Joining us now is the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Ilyse Hogue. And full disclosure, I serve on the board of NARAL Pro-Choice America, but thank you so much for joining us. You know, Ilyse, one of the things that struck me, you know, in looking at those numbers and that map is we've been talking a lot about organizing and mobilizing and sort of women's rights, and in the context of the March on Washington, we're really talking about women's freedom and the ability to make your own choices over a legal procedure.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that people forget is at the time of Seneca Falls, when all of these heroes and sheroes were out there fighting for the women's right to vote, abortion was actually legal up until the time of quickening. So some of the antis love to throw around that abortion was never part of Seneca Falls. Well, why would it be? Because it was actually legal at the time. Contraception and family planning was very much a part of the women's equality agenda, and winning the right to vote was seen as a step down that path. They could not have predicted that we would now be at the ground zero of a medical procedure that is rolling back all of the rights that they fought so hard for. And it's really a disgrace to their memory. It's a disgrace to the values that they fought for. And it's up to us to carry on that fight.
It's also really an economic issue. You know, when you look at, I think we have a map of the distance that people have to travel to clinics. Caddy, I mean, particularly low-income women are going to be more disadvantaged because they will have to take off work to try to get to where they're going if they have a car. If they don't have a car, we're talking about a 15-mile median distance. And so and rural women in particular. So again, it not only hurts women, but it hurts poor women the most.
I mean, that's been the story, hasn't it, of the history of abortion for decades. I imagine Ilyse knows this much better than I do, but that it has always been an economic issue. If you were a wealthy woman who got pregnant with a pregnancy that she wanted to terminate, you could find yourself access to an abortion. That was not the case if you were poor. It was much, much harder. It always has been, and it's becoming increasingly so with the number of abortion clinics that are being closed in the country. But I wanted to ask Ilyse actually about those numbers. Are those numbers reflective of states that are clamping down on access to abortion, or is there something else going on with some of those clinics as well?
Well, I mean, in fact, we're seeing more states look at legislation and pass legislation that would restrict abortion. I think this is the first wave of clinic closures we're going to see. In fact, the clinic closures in Texas are not a result of the most recent legislation that got so much attention in Texas. This is a result of regulations and family planning cuts that came in 2010, 2011. But I think the important point as well to what Caddy and you are both saying, Karen, is look at who's behind this legislation that's creating the clinic closures. These are the exact same legislators that vote against equal pay, that vote against the kind of help for women who choose to carry their pregnancies to term. In California, we're seeing a real push towards expansion of services. The people opposing that are the same people opposing added assistance for low-income women who choose to have more children. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, according to these men.
Right, and the other argument, Michael, that we've heard is the Gosnell case, I think, raised a lot of issues across the spectrum for a lot of us. You heard some suggesting that is what happens because of access to abortion care, and many of us in the pro-choice movement believe that's what's going to happen if we don't have access to quality care, particularly when you heard those horror stories of low-income women who I think most people don't realize don't have other health care options. They don't have other places to go earlier in their pregnancies.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, if it's legal, it's safe. It's an old adage, and it's true. And that's the way to keep it safe, is to keep it legal. And then if Roe v. Wade is overturned, of course, what 12 states would probably pass abortion rights laws in some way, shape, or form? That's the latest number I knew.
Abortion restriction laws or abortion, yeah. And by the way, Roe is not real for so many women already.
Yes, exactly.
And you're right, if Roe was overturned, it would impact even more women across the board.
Well, and you know, the other thing, Michael, that we're seeing is in the myriad of the different types of laws are no exceptions for rape. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that prior to Obamacare, rape is a pre-existing condition, actually. So is actually pregnancy. So, you know, what we're seeing is, again, squeezing women, taking away their rights, and essentially, if a woman is raped, forcing her to then have to have that rapist baby and having no real rights over her own body.
Right, and you know, there's a kind of larger political frame to this, and the point you make goes right to it, which is that, you know, the American public is somewhere in a gray middle on abortion when you look at the polling, and different questions get different answers, but it's, you know, we're kind of in a gray middle area. There's not a clear consensus, there's division. But for the Republican Party, the idea when it comes to this issue, where there may be a lot of Americans in the middle who say, I'm not comfortable with late-term abortions, there's some things I don't think it should be unregulated, unrestricted. But when you start talking about the kind of thing you were just talking about, and when you're saying if you were raped, you have to have the baby, you have people like the candidates in the last cycle, Murdoch and the other guy, I forget. It's just, it's devastating for the Republican Party. It's a real fundamental dynamic in American politics that allows Democrats to talk about this war on women. And I think it's actually quite self-defeating for people who want, you know, more moderate abortion regulations, who say, well, we don't want it to be unlimited, we want to do some things, but that you have this very conservative faction on these issues. It's very strong right now, it's very vocal, and it's doing a lot of damage to the party, and I think it's doing damage to people who think there's a middle ground.
Here's what I don't understand about some members of the Republican Party, particularly in the hierarchy, and those who are concerned about what's being perceived as a war on women, and particularly looking at the fact that increasing numbers of suburban women voters are going to be the people that decide elections in the future. You don't want to alienate them, but is there concern about the legislation and what's happening with clinics and access to family planning and access to abortions where it's legal, or is there concern about the kind of language that's being used by some members of the party?
You know, I think a lot of it is I mean, Ilyse and I have talked about this, the tone and the tenor of the conversation, particularly last year when you heard, you know, in state legislatures, people saying things like, well, women would use, if we made a rape exception, they'd use it as a loophole. I mean, just talking about a woman as a human being in that way, I think that's part of what they miscalculated. And you know, Ilyse, the final question to you I wanted to ask is that I think part of what we're seeing is, again, this tied in for women as part of fundamental freedom, fundamental human rights in terms of how we're viewed as equal participants in this society.
Absolutely. And one thing that the polling does clearly show is that most Americans, regardless of their moral stance, believe that when forced to choose between legislators making the decision for someone else, or a woman and their doctor and their family and their God making this decision, they choose the latter. And that's because most Americans trust me, trust Caddy, trust you, trust us to go to our partners and our doctors and make the best decision for us. Why doesn't the Republican Party trust us?
There you go. Very fine question. Thanks, Ilyse Hogue, head of NARAL Pro-Choice America.